Black bus driver tries to save a young man. Next day, a stranger knocks on his door. Samuel was sitting in the driver's seat of the old bus, his hands steady on the wheel as he navigated through the crowded streets of the city. It was another typical morning, with the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the busy urban landscape. Samuel had been driving the city bus for nearly 15 years, and he had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the route, the familiar stops, the daily commuters, and the hustle of the city. He knew every curve and bump on the road, every shortcut, and every face that climbed aboard. But even after so many years, there were moments that stood out, moments that he would never forget. This morning felt different. As the bus rumbled down the street, Samuel glanced at the rearview mirror and caught sight of a young man stepping onto the bus at the next stop. The young man's face was a mix of fear and exhaustion. He hesitated for a moment before sliding through the doors, his eyes darting around nervously as he scanned the faces of the other passengers. His clothes were a bit worn, and there was something about the way he carried himself that made Samuel think he was in trouble. The bus was almost full, but there was a seat open near the back. The young man walked towards it, but he kept looking over his shoulder as though he was expecting something. Samuel had seen people like him before, people who carried something heavy on their shoulders, something they didn't want anyone to see. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it. It was in the way the young man's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the metal pole by the seat. As the bus began moving again, Samuel turned his attention back to the road, his eyes focused on the traffic ahead. But he kept an eye on the young man in the rearview mirror. He was still looking around, clearly uncomfortable. Samuel had dealt with all kinds of passengers in his years of driving, from the quiet commuters who barely looked up from their phones to the loud, disruptive ones who liked to make a scene. But this young man, he was different. There was a quiet urgency about him that Samuel couldn't ignore. A few minutes passed, and the bus made its next stop. A group of teenagers boarded, laughing loudly as they pushed their way down the aisle, taking up seats in the middle of the bus. They were the usual crowd, loud, full of energy, and oblivious to the others around them. Samuel didn't mind them. He had grown used to their antics. But as they moved to the back of the bus, something happened that caught his attention. One of the teenagers, tall and with a cocky grin on his face, spotted the young man sitting near the back of the bus. He nudged his friends and pointed. The young man stiffened, his face going pale as he recognized the group. Samuel could see it in his eyes, the fear, the recognition, the realization that something bad was about to happen. The teenager approached the young man with a swagger in his step, his friends following closely behind. "Well, well," the teenager said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look who we have here." The group laughed, circling the young man like predators closing in on their prey. Samuel's instincts kicked in. He had seen this before, bullies picking on someone weaker. He wasn't going to stand by and let it happen, not on his bus, not today. He knew that if he didn't intervene, things could get out of hand very quickly. He took a deep breath and stepped out of his seat, moving toward the back of the bus. The young man looked up at him, his eyes pleading, but he didn't speak. Samuel could tell he was scared, terrified even. The teenagers had already begun their taunts, calling the young man names and pushing him around in the aisle. Samuel could see the panic building in the young man's face. "Hey," Samuel called out, his voice firm. "Knock it off, that's enough." The teenagers stopped for a moment, their attention turning to Samuel. The one who had been leading the group, the one with the cocky grin, looked Samuel up and down. "What's your problem, man?" he sneered. "You gonna stand up for this loser?" Samuel stood tall, meeting the teenager's gaze. "This is my bus," he said, his voice steady. "And I don't care who you are. No one messes with someone like that on my watch." The teenager's grin faltered for a moment. He hadn't expected Samuel to stand up to him. But instead of backing down, the teenager puffed out his chest, trying to intimidate the bus driver. "What's it to you?" he asked, taking a step closer. Samuel didn't flinch. "I said stop, or I'll call the cops. You want to deal with that?" There was a tense silence. The teenagers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. The young man was still sitting, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his body stiff with fear. Samuel could see how much he wanted to escape, but he couldn't, not with these kids around. Finally, the teenager who had been taunting the young man shrugged and stepped back. "Whatever," he muttered. "I don't have time for this." With a wave to his friends, he turned and walked toward the front of the bus, his group following behind. Samuel returned to his seat, his eyes still on the young man. The bus was quiet again, but the tension in the air hadn't completely disappeared. The young man didn't say anything, but Samuel noticed him glance up, his eyes filled with gratitude. The rest of the ride went by without incident. The young man stayed silent, lost in his thoughts, and Samuel focused on the road ahead. But as the bus neared the next stop, the young man stood up, hesitated for a moment, and then quietly made his way to the door. Without looking back, he stepped off the bus and disappeared into the crowd. Samuel watched him go, feeling a strange sense of worry settle in his chest. He didn't know the young man's story, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't just another passenger. There was something about him, something that tugged at Samuel's heart. As the bus pulled away from the stop, Samuel found himself wondering what would happen to the young man. Would he be okay? Would he be safe? But the bus kept moving, and Samuel knew he had to keep his focus. There would always be more passengers, more faces to remember, more stories to follow. But something about this one, something about Marcus, stayed with him. The day after the encounter on the bus, Samuel couldn't stop thinking about the young man, Marcus. He had been driving his bus for so many years, encountering all kinds of people, but something about Marcus stuck with him. The way the young man had looked, how he seemed so lost and frightened, it wasn't like the usual passengers he dealt with. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something bigger than a simple encounter. There was more to Marcus's story, something Samuel hadn't yet uncovered. As Samuel drove his usual route, he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than usual, as though expecting to see Marcus again. The bus was crowded that morning, but it didn't matter. His mind wasn't on the road or the passengers, it was on Marcus. Why had he been so scared? Why had he left the bus so quickly without saying a word? Samuel had done his best to intervene and stop the bullying, but he still didn't know if it was enough to protect Marcus from whatever was chasing him. For hours, Samuel's thoughts kept drifting back to that moment on the bus. The group of teenagers had made fun of Marcus, and he hadn't fought back. Instead, he had just sat there, looking like he wanted to disappear. He wasn't just some random passenger. He was in trouble, Samuel could tell. The question was, what kind of trouble, and how deep did it go? That night, Samuel sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the flickering television but barely watching it. His mind was preoccupied. It was a quiet evening, and he had time to think. He thought about his own youth, about growing up in a rough part of town, facing his own struggles. He had been lucky to escape the traps that so many others fell into. He had found stability, even if it meant a tough job as a bus driver. He had always tried to help those around him, whether it was lending a hand to an elderly woman, offering advice to a troubled passenger, or just listening when someone needed to talk. But Marcus, he was different. There was something in his eyes that told Samuel the boy wasn't just another lost soul looking for a way out. Samuel thought back to his own experiences when he was Marcus's age. The challenges, the pressure to fit in, the temptation to take the wrong path, it had all been there. He remembered the feeling of fear, how everything felt uncertain, but somehow he had made it through. He had learned to steer clear of the things that would have dragged him down. What if Marcus wasn't able to do that? What if, just like Samuel once had, he was struggling to find a way out, only to be pulled back in? He sighed, shaking his head as if to clear his thoughts. But the weight of the question lingered. He had a sense of responsibility now. He didn't even know Marcus's last name, but he felt a deep need to help him. Maybe it was because he knew what it was like to be young, to be afraid of the world around you, to want to break free from something but not knowing how. Samuel had spent years trying to make a difference in small ways, but this felt like one of those rare moments when he could do more, much more. As Samuel lay in bed that night, sleep didn't come easily. He kept seeing Marcus's face, his eyes filled with anxiety, and he couldn't stop wondering what had happened to him. Where was he now? Was he hiding, running from something even worse than what Samuel had seen on the bus? Samuel had no way of knowing, but he knew that he couldn't just let it go. He couldn't ignore the gut feeling that told him there was more to the story. The next morning, Samuel woke up early, the nagging thought of Marcus still fresh in his mind. He wasn't sure what to do about it. He thought about going to the police, but that didn't feel right. Marcus hadn't asked for help directly, and Samuel didn't want to make things worse by involving the authorities. It felt like an invasion of privacy, and what if the boy didn't want to be found? Samuel had to tread carefully. But the more he thought about it, The more he realized he couldn't just go on with his normal routine, pretending he hadn't seen something important. On his way to work, as the city streets blurred outside the bus windows, Samuel noticed a familiar face at one of the bus stops, an older woman he had seen many times before. Her name was Mrs. Thompson, and she lived in the same neighborhood as Marcus. Samuel had exchanged pleasantries with her a few times, and he had a feeling she might know something about the young man. She was friendly, always asking how his day was going, but today Samuel was more focused than usual. When the bus pulled over to the stop, Samuel slowed down, allowing the woman to board. As she walked past him, Samuel smiled and said, "Morning, Mrs. Thompson. How's everything today?" "Oh, it's been a quiet morning," she replied with a smile, sitting down in her usual seat near the front. Samuel took a deep breath before speaking again. "I was wondering, Mrs. Thompson, if you've seen a young man named Marcus around here. Maybe he's a friend of yours or someone in the neighborhood." Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow at the mention of the name. "Marcus? Can't say I know him personally, but there's a boy with that name living in the building across from mine." "Not sure if he's the same one you're talking about, though." Samuel nodded, his heart picking up speed. "You think he might be in trouble?" Mrs. Thompson looked at him for a moment as if sizing him up. "Well, I've seen him around, sure, but he keeps to himself." "I heard some things, though. He's had a rough time. You know how things can be around here. It's not easy for kids like him." Samuel's curiosity was piqued. "What do you mean by rough?" Mrs. Thompson lowered her voice slightly, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "I don't know all the details, but word is that he's been mixed up with some bad people. Some people who don't let you walk away once you're in. It's not the kind of trouble you just get out of easily, you know. He's been running from something for a while now." Samuel's heart sank as Mrs. Thompson's words hung in the air. "I'm worried about him," she added softly. "I don't know what's going on, but it's not good. I just hope someone can get through to him before it's too late." The bus continued down the road, but Samuel's mind was racing. What kind of trouble was Marcus really in? How deep did it go? Samuel felt a mixture of fear and determination settle in his chest. He wasn't going to just let this go. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to help Marcus. The young man needed someone on his side, and Samuel was ready to be that person, whether Marcus wanted it or not. As the day went on, Samuel couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Thompson had said. It was clear that Marcus wasn't just a frightened kid on a bus. He was running from something much bigger and much darker than anyone could have imagined, and Samuel knew that he had to do something. He just didn't know where to start. The next day, Samuel woke up earlier than usual, his mind still buzzing with thoughts of Marcus. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something more, something important. He had spoken to Mrs. Thompson the day before, and her words had only deepened his sense of urgency. Marcus was in trouble, and Samuel felt a sense of responsibility to help him, even though he didn't know him very well. It was the way Marcus had looked at him, the fear in his eyes, the way he left the bus so quickly without a word. Something wasn't right, and Samuel couldn't just ignore it. After a quick breakfast, Samuel got ready for work, his routine almost automatic. But today, his thoughts were constantly on Marcus. He couldn't stop wondering where he was, if he was okay, and what kind of trouble he had gotten himself into. Samuel had grown up in a neighborhood where it wasn't hard to fall into bad situations, and he knew firsthand how quickly life could spiral out of control. It made him worry even more for Marcus. As he climbed into the bus and started his route, Samuel kept his eyes peeled for anything unusual. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would catch sight of Marcus or hear something that could point him in the right direction. The morning rush was the usual mix of commuters, people going about their daily routines, but Samuel couldn't help but feel like something was missing. Every stop, every passenger, he was hoping for a sign, something to tell him what he should do next. By midday, Samuel had made his usual rounds, but there was still no sign of Marcus. He started to feel discouraged, but he refused to let the thought of giving up creep into his mind. He couldn't, not when there was still a chance to help. He thought about Mrs. Thompson again and the few details she had shared. The young man was likely caught in something bigger than he could handle, but there was still time to make things right. It was when he pulled up to a stop near a small park that he noticed something strange. A man was standing across the street, looking directly at him as the bus approached. Samuel didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way the man stood, like he was waiting for something or someone. His eyes locked with Samuel's for a moment before he quickly glanced away, his posture stiff and almost nervous. It was only a brief moment, but something about it caught Samuel's attention. As the bus reached the stop, the man remained on the other side of the street, watching the passengers get off and on. Samuel didn't know why, but he had the feeling that the man was connected to Marcus somehow. It was a gut feeling, one he couldn't explain. After a moment's hesitation, Samuel pulled the bus over to the curb, the door opening as usual. The man didn't immediately board, but Samuel watched him from the corner of his eye. Something didn't sit right. He was still standing there, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His gaze flickered back and forth, like he was unsure whether to come closer or walk away. For a moment, Samuel thought about ignoring him and continuing his route, but that nagging feeling in the back of his mind pushed him to act. "Hey, you there," Samuel called out, his voice calm but firm. The man froze for a moment and then slowly turned toward the bus. Samuel waited, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the situation was too strange to ignore. The man hesitated for a few seconds before walking toward the bus. When he reached the door, he looked up at Samuel, his face tight with tension. There was something almost apologetic in his eyes, but he didn't speak at first. Samuel raised an eyebrow, silently urging him to say something. Finally, the man spoke. "I'm looking for someone," he said quietly. His voice was rough, as if he had been holding something back for a long time. Samuel didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. "I need to find Marcus," the man added, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment. "I don't know where he is, but he's in trouble, and I think he's hiding around here." The words hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where things started to make sense. The stranger's connection to Marcus was now clear. But there was something in the man's eyes that made Samuel uneasy, something desperate, something that made him think this wasn't just a search for a missing person. It was much more. "What do you know about Marcus?" Samuel asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. He had to be careful. There was something off about this man. He didn't know if he could trust him yet. The man looked at Samuel for a long moment, his face hardening. "I don't have time to explain everything, but Marcus is in danger. He tried to get away, but there are people after him, people who won't stop until they get what they want. And I think you might have seen him yesterday." Samuel nodded slowly, realizing the full weight of the situation. The young man, Marcus, wasn't just some lost teenager looking for a way out. He had been running from something dangerous, something that could hurt him. The stranger wasn't just some concerned family member. He was part of whatever mess Marcus had found himself in. "You know where he is, don't you?" the man asked, his voice urgent now. Samuel hesitated. He knew that this was a delicate situation. If he helped this man, he might be putting himself in danger. But if he didn't help, Marcus could be lost forever, or worse, hurt by the people chasing him. Samuel wasn't sure what to do, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk away. He had already stepped in once, and now he was involved. "I don't know where he is," Samuel said finally, his voice steady despite the confusion in his mind. "But I saw him yesterday. I think he's scared. He didn't talk much, but I know he's not just running from some petty problem. There's something bigger at play here." The man's face softened for a moment, and he nodded as if he understood. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for involving you in this, but if you see him again, if you find him, you have to let me know. It's important. He's been mixed up with some dangerous people, and they won't stop until they find him." Samuel didn't answer right away. He wanted to ask more questions, wanted to know who the man was and why he was so involved in Marcus's life. But something told him it wasn't the right time. The stranger's urgency, his need to find Marcus, it was all too real. "I'll keep an eye out," Samuel said at last, "but you have to understand I'm just a bus driver. I can't get involved in something like this." The man nodded again, his eyes briefly meeting Samuel's. "I understand, but if you see him, please don't turn your back on him. He's just a kid trying to survive." With that, the man stepped away from the bus, walking quickly down the street. Samuel watched him go, his mind racing. He had just crossed a line, whether he realized it or not. He wasn't sure what kind of trouble he had gotten himself into, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't back down now. The days that followed were a blur for Samuel. Every morning, as he sat behind the wheel of the bus, he found his mind wandering back to the conversation with the stranger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Marcus was clearly caught up in something dangerous, and now Samuel had become a part of it, whether he liked it or not. Samuel did his best to keep his focus on his job, but every time he saw a new face on the bus or heard a passing conversation, his mind would race with thoughts of Marcus. He had promised the stranger that he would keep an eye out, but what exactly did that mean? How could he help someone he barely knew, someone who might be in hiding from people who were out to hurt him? One morning, while driving his usual route, Samuel noticed something different. The city was quieter than usual, fewer cars on the road, fewer people walking on the sidewalks. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Samuel glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a few familiar faces, but nothing caught his attention. Still, that nagging feeling of unease never left him. He was waiting for something, and he didn't know exactly what it was. That afternoon, after a particularly long and tiring shift, Samuel stopped by a small cafe to grab a cup of coffee before heading home. As he sat at a corner table, sipping the warm drink, he noticed a woman sitting at the bar across the room. She was reading a newspaper, her hair tied back in a loose bun, and she looked completely absorbed in the article she was reading. Samuel almost didn't pay her any attention, but something about her seemed familiar. For a moment he stared at her, trying to place where he had seen her before. Then it hit him. She had been on the bus the day Marcus had boarded. She was a regular passenger, someone who often caught the same route. Samuel didn't know her name, but he recognized her face. She seemed to be in her late 30s, with sharp features and a calm demeanor. What caught his attention, however, was the look on her face. She was staring intently at the newspaper, but there was something more to her gaze, a flicker of recognition as she glanced up briefly and locked eyes with Samuel. A chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something that could help him find Marcus. Maybe she had seen him after all, maybe she knew where he had gone, or maybe, just maybe, she was involved in the whole situation. Samuel didn't know what to do. He wasn't one to get involved in other people's business, but his instincts told him that if he didn't act now, he might never have another chance to uncover the truth. Slowly, he stood up from his table and walked over to the bar where the woman was sitting. She didn't seem to notice him at first, so he cleared his throat, gently getting her attention. "Excuse me," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "I couldn't help but notice you've been on my bus before. I was wondering if you've seen a young man named Marcus around." The woman's eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a brief moment, Samuel thought she might brush him off. Instead, she leaned back in her seat and studied him, her expression unreadable. There was a pause, then she set her newspaper down on the counter and spoke. "You're the bus driver, right?" she asked, her tone careful, almost cautious. "What do you want with Marcus?" Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to be so direct, but he could tell she wasn't someone who liked to waste time. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. I don't know what's going on, but I think he's in trouble. He boarded my bus a few days ago, and he seemed scared. A group of kids tried to mess with him, and I stepped in to help, but after that, he just ran off. I haven't seen him since, and I don't know what happened to him. I'm just trying to find him, make sure he's okay." The woman's eyes softened slightly, but her expression didn't change. She seemed to weigh his words carefully before responding. "I know Marcus," she said quietly. "I've seen him around here for a while. He's been through a lot, more than you probably realize. But the last few days, he's been laying low. He's scared, and he's been trying to keep out of sight. I think he's hiding from some people who won't leave him alone." Samuel felt a knot form in his stomach. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud from someone who seemed to know Marcus made it all the more real. "Do you know where he is?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman hesitated. "I can't tell you exactly. But I do know where he's been staying. He's been hiding in an old building near the edge of town. I don't think he's safe there, but he's been too scared to leave. It's the only place he feels he can be alone." Samuel's mind was racing. He had a name, a place to start. But something still didn't sit right with him. Why had Marcus gone into hiding? Why hadn't he reached out for help? What kind of trouble had he gotten into that made him so afraid? The woman looked at Samuel with a mixture of pity and concern. "You're involved now whether you want to be or not," she said quietly. "If you're going to help him, you need to understand what you're up against. Marcus isn't just a kid running from a bad situation. He's been tangled up with some very dangerous people, and they won't let him go easily." Samuel swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what kind of danger he was stepping into, but he knew one thing: he couldn't turn back now. Marcus needed him, and if there was any way he could help, he would do whatever it took. "Thank you," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "I'll find him, and I'll make sure he's safe." The woman nodded, her expression serious. "Be careful, Samuel. You don't know what you're getting into, but if you really want to help him, you'll have to be strong, stronger than you've ever been before." As Samuel walked out of the cafe, he felt a new weight settle on his shoulders. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he had made up his mind. He was going to find Marcus. He was going to do whatever it took to make sure he was safe. But first, he had to track down that old building, find the hiding place where Marcus had been staying, and figure out how to get him out of whatever mess he had gotten himself into. Samuel didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't turn back now. Samuel's determination grew stronger with each passing day. He couldn't get Marcus out of his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the young man's face, filled with fear and uncertainty. Samuel had seen enough in his life to know that Marcus wasn't just some kid caught up in a tough situation. He was running from something much more dangerous, something that could change his life forever. And Samuel was now tangled up in it too, whether he liked it or not. After the conversation with the woman at the cafe, Samuel had a direction. He had a place to go, a starting point. But knowing where to go wasn't the same as knowing how to handle what he might find. The building the woman had mentioned was a few miles outside the city, near the edge of town. It was an old warehouse district, full of abandoned buildings and forgotten structures. Samuel knew it wasn't the safest part of town, but he had seen worse in his years as a bus driver. This, however, felt different. This was personal. He was no longer just a witness to someone's struggle. He was now part of the story. Samuel spent the next few days quietly preparing. He didn't want to involve the police yet. He wasn't sure how much they would be able to do, and he didn't want to risk making things worse for Marcus. He wasn't even sure Marcus wanted to be found. But the more Samuel thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't leave him out there, hiding from the world, alone and afraid. One morning, after finishing his shift, Samuel drove to the warehouse district. The air was thick with the smell of old concrete and rust. The buildings around him were decaying, their windows broken or boarded up. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional stray dog wandering through the area. It felt like the kind of place where you could easily disappear, and that thought made Samuel's stomach tighten. This was where Marcus had been hiding, and Samuel was here to find him. As he walked down the narrow street, his footsteps echoing off the abandoned buildings, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. It was a quiet place, and every sound seemed amplified: the wind rustling the leaves, the distant sound of a car, the creaking of metal. Samuel kept his eyes peeled, looking for any sign of Marcus. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Maybe he thought he'd see the young man sitting on a ledge, maybe hear his footsteps in the distance. But the place was eerily still. He paused in front of one of the buildings, an old brick structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging off its hinges. Samuel took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had to do this. He had to find Marcus and make sure he was okay. He pushed the door open carefully, the old wood creaking under his touch. Inside, it was dark, the only light coming from cracks in the walls where the sunlight filtered through. The air smelled stale, like dust and mildew, and it felt colder than it should have been. Samuel stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He could see old crates and broken furniture scattered around the room. There was no sign of Marcus, but Samuel didn't give up. He continued searching, moving deeper into the building. As he walked through the empty hallways, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his decision. What if Marcus didn't want to be found? What if he was hiding because he didn't trust anyone? Samuel had no way of knowing for sure, but he couldn't just turn back now. He had to try. Finally, after what felt like hours, Samuel found a small room at the back of the building. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear faint sounds coming from inside, soft rustling, the sound of someone shifting around. He froze for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it Marcus? Or was it someone else? Samuel pushed the door open slowly, trying not to make a sound. Inside, he found Marcus, sitting on the floor, his back against the wall. His clothes were dirty, and his face was thinner than Samuel remembered. He looked up as the door creaked open, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. Marcus, Samuel said gently, his voice soft. It's me, Samuel. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help. Marcus stared at him for a moment, unsure whether to trust him. Samuel could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to run, but he was too tired. He wanted to fight, but there was no one left to fight against. Samuel stepped into the room, slowly, carefully, so as not to startle him. I know you're scared, Samuel continued, his voice steady. But you don't have to be alone anymore. I'm not going to let them hurt you. Whatever's going on, we can figure it out together. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then slowly, Marcus spoke. I didn't know where else to go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I was wrong. Samuel sat down next to him, not saying anything for a moment. He didn't need to say anything. He just let Marcus speak, letting him share whatever he felt he needed to say. Marcus was quiet for a while, then he looked up at Samuel, his eyes filled with guilt and fear. I've been running from some people, he explained. People who don't let you walk away. They've been after me for a while, and I don't know how to get away from them. I thought if I hid here, maybe they wouldn't find me. Samuel's heart ached for the young man sitting beside him. He had no idea what kind of pressure Marcus had been under, what kind of fear he had been living with. It was clear now that Marcus wasn't just some kid trying to avoid trouble. He had been trying to escape something real, something dangerous. I'm here now, Samuel said, his voice filled with determination. You don't have to hide anymore. We're going to get you out of this. Marcus looked at him, uncertainty still clouding his face. How? He asked, his voice trembling. They'll just keep coming after me. They won't stop. Samuel looked around the room, his mind working quickly. He had no answers, no easy solutions, but he wasn't about to leave Marcus here, not when he had a chance to help. We'll figure something out, he said firmly. But first, we have to get you out of here. You can't stay in this place anymore. It's not safe. With those words, Marcus finally stood up, his body stiff from sitting on the cold floor for so long. He was hesitant, but Samuel could see that he was willing to trust him. Together, they made their way out of the building, Samuel leading the way. As they stepped into the daylight, Samuel felt a surge of relief. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: Marcus wasn't alone anymore. And no matter what it took, Samuel was going to make sure he stayed safe. As Samuel and Marcus walked away from the old building, the weight of the situation began to sink in. The quiet streets seemed to echo with the tension between them. Marcus was walking a few steps ahead, his shoulders slumped, as though he was still unsure whether he was safe. Samuel could feel the fear radiating from him, but he knew that the hardest part was behind them. They had made it out of the building, but they weren't out of danger yet. Samuel kept a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He didn't want to show Marcus that he was worried. He wanted to be the strong one. But he knew that what they had just done wasn't easy. They were in the middle of a city that wasn't exactly friendly, and he had no idea what the next move would be. What if Marcus was still being hunted? What if they were being followed right now? The fear was still there, lurking in the back of Samuel's mind, but he kept pushing it aside. They had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop. As they walked, Samuel tried to keep the conversation light. He didn't want to add to Marcus's burden by discussing the danger they were both in. So, what made you take the bus that day? Samuel asked, trying to break the silence. What brought you to me? Marcus looked over at him, his eyes still guarded. For a moment, Samuel thought he wouldn't answer. But then, after a long pause, Marcus spoke softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know where else to go. I was trying to get away from them. And when I saw you step in and stop those guys from picking on me, I don't know, I guess I just trusted you. Samuel nodded slowly, his heart aching for the young man. He could hear the weight of Marcus's words, the sense of hopelessness in them. He could feel the fear that Marcus had been carrying, the fear of not knowing who to trust, of feeling like he was alone in the world. Samuel knew that feeling well, but he also knew that Marcus wasn't alone anymore. He was going to help him, no matter what it took. We'll figure it out, Marcus, Samuel said, his voice firm but kind. You're not alone in this anymore. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. They continued walking through the streets, the city around them buzzing with life, but it felt like they were in their own little bubble, separated from the world. Every now and then, Marcus would glance over at Samuel, his eyes searching for something. Maybe it was reassurance. Maybe it was just the need to know that he wasn't dreaming, that there was someone out there who cared. They made their way to a nearby diner, a small, quiet place that Samuel knew was safe. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't filled with people. It was the kind of place where you could just slip in and not attract attention. Samuel knew they needed a place to lay low to figure out their next move. The diner was the perfect spot. As they walked inside, the waitress, a kind-looking woman with graying hair, smiled at them. "Morning, Samuel," she said warmly. "The usual," Samuel smiled back, grateful for the normalcy of the moment. "Yeah, I'll have the usual, and he'll have the same," he said, motioning toward Marcus. The waitress nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Samuel and Marcus sat at a corner booth, the soft hum of the diner's air conditioning filling the silence. For a moment, Samuel allowed himself to relax, letting the tension in his shoulders ease. He knew they had to keep moving, but this felt like a small victory. They had made it out of the building. They were safe for now. Marcus, who had been silent for most of the walk, finally spoke again. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't know what I would have done without you. I don't even know why you're helping me. I'm not anyone important. I'm just a kid trying to get away from everything." Samuel looked at him, his eyes soft but steady. "You're more important than you think. No one should have to go through what you've been through, Marcus. No one should have to feel like they're alone. You've got a chance now, and I'm not going to let you waste it." Marcus looked down at his hands, his fingers nervously tapping on the table. "I don't know how to get out of this," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix all the mistakes I've made. How can I just walk away from everything?" Samuel leaned forward, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "You can start by making one good choice, just one, every day. You don't have to fix everything at once, and you don't have to do it alone. You've already taken the hardest step, asking for help. The rest we'll figure out together." For the first time in a long time, Marcus seemed to relax. His shoulders loosened, and the guarded look in his eyes began to fade. He looked at Samuel, and for a moment there was a flicker of hope in his gaze. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but he didn't have to figure it out alone anymore. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the dark place he had been stuck in. As the waitress returned with their food, the conversation shifted. They talked about small things, nothing too heavy, just enough to pass the time. Samuel kept the mood light, not wanting to overwhelm Marcus with too much too soon. They ate their meal, and for a while things felt almost normal, as though Marcus's world hadn't been turned upside down. But Samuel knew that the calm wouldn't last forever. They couldn't stay here long, and they couldn't keep running. Marcus was still in danger, and it wasn't just the people chasing him. It was the fear, the uncertainty that hung over him. But Samuel was determined to help him face it, one step at a time. After they finished eating, Samuel paid the bill, and they stepped outside into the warmth of the afternoon sun. The streets were still busy, but the weight of the world seemed a little lighter. They were moving forward, even if they didn't know exactly where the road would lead. "I'll take you somewhere safe," Samuel said as they walked toward the bus. "We'll figure out the next steps together." Marcus nodded, the ghost of a smile on his face. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. He had someone by his side, someone who cared. And that, for now, was enough.